So the first step in replacing the shock absorber and bump stops on the VW Passat is to remove the wheel. So I've jacked the car up here and I've just put the wheel back under for safety to give some extra support, as well as an axle stand, so being doubly sure here. What you'll need for this job are 16mm socket and a 21mm spanner. You'll also find it useful to have a Torx T20 and 25 driver to be able to remove parts of the inner wheel liner, which just gives a bit of better access to be able to remove two of the top bolts. The 21mm bolt that you need to undo is at the bottom of the shock absorber, and the two 16mm that you need the socket for are at the top on the top mount. And so I'm just going to remove one of the fixing screws for the wheel liner, and that will give a bit of better view and better access. I'd recommend removing the 21mm bolt at the bottom of the shock absorber. Do that first. That is the most difficult one and can be very, very difficult to remove. You may need several spanners together to give enough leverage to be able to shift it. And until you've done that, then there's no point really doing the top ones, because this bottom one is the most difficult to remove. So I'm going to do that first. So this has now been loosened off, and we must be almost near to the bolt coming out of the hub. This to the top mount a lot easier. So this is a T25 Torx screw. So if we just put that in. Right at the top here you can just see the two 16mm bolts. These hold the top mount in place right at the top of the shock absorber. So we're just going to undo those, and it will then free the shock absorber up so we can drop it down. Really need a 16mm socket. It's a lot easier with an extension arm on it, and that will let you get the bolts out. Once you've released the two 16mm bolts at the top, it's a simple case of pulling the top mount through, and the last step is just to undo the bolt at the bottom. Last couple of turns and the shock absorber will then come out. Once the shock absorber is out, you can see the length of the bolt there, and you'll actually find as you're removing it, because of the length, you get very close to the coil spring as it's almost out. And you can see the problem we have here is the bump stop is broken in half. So I'm just going to show you the difference. That's the existing shock absorber, barely moving. New one, you can press it down and then let go. You'll see it gradually comes out. To remove the top nut on the old shock absorber, I used a pair of mole grips to hold the shock absorber, and then you need, it's a 16mm nut at the top, and I actually used a torque wrench, a torque gun to remove it, and that is now loosened. And reassembly is very straightforward. First put on the dust cover, then the bump stop, and finally the top mount, and the bump stop squeezes into the bottom of the top mount. So, and the last bit is just to tighten up the nut on the top, and that just needs to hold the top mount in place, so I just need to tighten that. With the nut all fitted and tightened, you can see there's no movement in the top mount there, and all ready to refit to the car. And this is just a simple case of the reverse of what we've just done. So put the bolts in, and top and bottom, and then wheel back on. So this was the hardest bit, actually getting the old one off. New bump stop and dust cover. And we have the bolt fitted at the bottom. So all that remains now is just to put the wheel back on, and then we're all done.